Ready to share? Oh, we're recording this just so everybody knows. So welcome everybody. I'm Daniel Lorison. I'm an associate professor of sociology at Swarthmore College and the director of the Healthy, Equitable, and Responsive Democracy Initiative there. This is the third in a series of 4 panels, webinars put on by 4 of us, myself, Wendy Lee, Jen Herwig, and Jennifer Dudley, co-sponsored by the political sociology section of ASA. And these are a series of panels designed to give us a chance to, as sociologists and adjacent folks, talk about the election that's coming up and talk about our understanding of US politics and what's happening in the country. So this one is on elites and politics. And as the 2024 election heats up, we know that political professionals and well-resourced organizations and individuals are mobilizing behind the scenes to influence not only the outcomes of the election in November, but the political agendas that will follow. So our panelists will discuss how their research sheds light on these dynamics and what it means for this election and for democracy writ large. I'm going to just tell you briefly about each of our panelists, and then we'll have them speak in turn. They'll give fairly brief presentations about their work and their research and their take on these questions. And then after that, we will move to, I'll have some questions for them. I'll let them ask some questions or respond to each other. And then we'll have hopefully a fair amount of time for you all to ask questions and discuss in the second half or third or so of the hour and a half that we've got. So that's the plan. Jumping right into it, we have 3 awesome panelists today. The first is Sarah Briner, who's the Director of Research and Strategy at opensecrets.org and is responsible for overseeing Open Secrets data analysis, research collaborations, and general data collection and quality. She's frequently cited as an expert on money and politics by media outlets and as a frequent guest on NPR, CBS, and more. Sarah also produces written reports for Open Secrets on topics including competitive congressional primaries, Democratic backsliding, and race and political financing. She received her PhD in political science from The Ohio State University. Next, we'll have James R. Jones, who's an associate professor of Africana Studies and Sociology and the inaugural director of the Sheila Y. Oliver Center for Politics and Race in America at Rutgers University, Newark. His research focuses on racial representation and inequality within American political institutions, with a particular emphasis on the experiences of Black government workers. Through his work, he explores the complex interplay between race, power, and inequality in state institutions. And he is the author of The Last Plantation, Racism and Resistance in the Halls of Congress, just out from Princeton University Press. And finally, we'll have Wendy Lee, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University. Her research examines the careers and social networks of policy professionals, the influence of corporate lobbyists over economic regulation, and how revolving doors between government and lobbying impact policymaking and democracy. So an all-star lineup that I'm really excited to hear from. And without further ado, our first speaker today will be Sarah Briner. So Sarah, I'll let you take it away. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. This is a great crowd and a great turnout. And it's always nice to be in spaces that I'm not familiar with. I'm neither a sociologist nor an academic, although I suppose I was trained as one, so not a sociologist, but an academic. So I'm really happy to be here today. And thank you so much to the organizers for thinking of me. I'm going to talk a little bit about what Open Secrets does. I will be sharing my screen, but I'll ramble for a moment first. Open Secrets, if you're not familiar, is a nonpartisan nonprofit organization. Our mission is to track the influence of money in politics. We primarily focus on federal content right now, but our sort of broad portfolio of data includes data from state and local races, as well as lobbying, the revolving door information, the personal financial information for members of Congress and the president, and more, foreign lobbying. So if it has to do with money and the way that it plays with politics, we are interested in it. I have worked at Open Secrets since 2011, and you heard my bio, but sort of looking at mega donors, looking at the political elites. I don't even think about it as looking at political elite. This is just the group of people whose names I see every day, and they are the political elite. So to me, it's kind of my life and my job. So I want to share first, just so that everybody has this handy. I'm going to drop this in the chat, and hopefully people can see it. Including, yes, okay, including guests. This is just a link roundup. And these, I'll make sure you guys can all see it. One moment. There we go. This just has some of the links that I'll be going through in my presentation today. So for safekeeping in the future, you'll be able to pull those up and use anytime. But in the meanwhile, let's share this screen. Share. Share. Done. And we'll view it. So yes, at Open Secrets, we interact with many different kinds of elite actors. We don't talk to them, obviously. I don't interact with them, but I see them on my computer and I look at them in our data. And there's sort of three main categories of folks who I would consider to be elite political actors in this space. Obviously, the politicians themselves, who are sort of the nexus for all of this. And then political lobbyists, and we'll talk a little bit about those at the end, and political donors. The political donors is the area that I personally have the most experience working with and looking at. I'm speaking with the reporter today about Timothy Mellon. So, it's just kind of everybody wants to know about who these folks are and why they're contributing so much money to the political process. But to me, it starts to get a little bit thorny because, if you look at the people on the top donor list for 2024 so far, so sort of this is roughly through the end of July, I'd say at this point, you'll see names: Timothy Mellon, Ken Griffin, Richard Uihlein, Jeffrey Yass, Paul Singer. These are all Republicans this cycle, a little bit unusual, but they are. Obviously, these are elite people. Timothy Mellon is the son of a man who bred horses, and he is the grandson of the former U.S. Secretary of the Treasury. He lists his occupation as retired. I think he must have worked at some point, but really his money comes from money. He comes from, institutional wealth, inherited wealth. And he took a private jet to get to high school. So this is an elite actor in American politics, but there is one photo of him in existence. One photo. I didn't know this until recently, but if you go looking for him, there is one picture of him that you can find on the internet. So he's a private person who has contributed thus far $115 million to largely conservative super PACs this cycle. These types of numbers, by the way, weren't possible 15 years ago. Nearly all of our top donors these days are contributing to fairly politically extreme political super PACs, as opposed to the party committees and the candidate committees that were the main recipients of this kind of money prior to the Citizens United decision. So Mellon is giving a lot of money supporting Donald Trump, but he's also supporting Robert F. Kennedy, or was, and various Republican Party committees. But really, when I look at this list, Ken Griffin, Richard Uihlein, these are folks who, in many cases, are important CEOs of major companies, but typically these are not household names. We won't see Elon Musk might be on here. He's a household name. He hasn't given, I think he's given $10,000 reported thus far this cycle. And maybe 200, maybe a little bit more last week, but not the 45 million a month that he has claimed that he will be giving. But generally speaking, most people don't know who these people are. And we're not going to see them get ambassadorships. We're not going to see them appointed as Secretary of State. So why are they doing this? Especially given that in many cases, given how lopsided their giving is, if their party doesn't win, all that money is gone. And I don't have $115 million, but to give that significantly, you don't expect to lose and you don't expect to get nothing out of it. So there's something going on here that I think is really interesting with these folks who give cycle after cycle in huge amounts and then don't see anything from it. It makes more sense to me to give and then to be appointed ambassador to, the Bahamas than it does to give $115 million to somebody who might lose and then get nothing. So it's an interesting sort of dynamic here. And we've seen it cycle after cycle. Sheldon Adelson, who died in 2021, was a mega repeat giver and didn't, see any sort of appointments based on that. But moving on, as a group, these folks are incredibly significant. So the top 100, I showed 5 on that last list. The top 10 donors thus far have given $519 million to the political federal entities this cycle, which is 7% of the overall money. So 10 donors, 7% of, we're talking billions of dollars at this point. The top 100 donors, 16%. Which, by the way, is the amount of the percentage of money coming from small donors as a class. So this is a extremely small group of folks who contributes an extremely large amount of money, influencing our dialogue, keeping political candidates in the race who might not otherwise be there, and driving the political narrative. How much power do they truly have? I don't know. I can look at the inputs. It's not my expertise to look at the outputs, and hopefully, some of the folks in this room can speak to that. Jumping down to the poor lobbyists, and I'm going to go fairly quickly from here on, but lobbyists are obviously political elites as well. And these are not small figures. These are the top, this is 2024 contributions from federal lobbyists this cycle. But you'll notice 571,000, there's a few zeros missing from that number to put him in the top category. And that's Jeffrey Kimball, the most generous lobbyist giver this cycle thus far. The other thing about lobbyists is that the reasons that they give are very different, I think. You'll see folks giving to both Democrats and Republicans. That is very unusual among top donors who tend to be ideologically driven. And it makes sense in the case of many of these lobbyists because they want to be able to talk to both parties once they, once the election's settled, they want to get introductions to both sets of tables. Obviously, some people specialize. Kimball is a Republican, Podesta is Democrat, and clients know that when they hire them. So I like to think of these are, I think the lobbyists get quoted as saying, like, I can't give $1 million. I have to work for my money. I have a job. And these are, I also have a job. I can give $571,000 to politicians with my salary, but it does put some perspective on it that as a class, this is a generous group of folks, but as a sort of subgroup, it's not. I'm going to bounce out of this real fast. So you can, on Open Secrets, you can dig into the contributions from these people as well as the clients that they represent. So that's in one of the links. You can see the contributions, who he's giving to. Again, these are going to be typically leadership members of Congress who serve leadership positions. In his case, it's a lot of Republicans. And then if you're curious about the sort of ways that these folks amass and use their power, we have a lot of information on Open Secrets about the way that they move through the revolving door. So just using, I think I spelled his name wrong, Kimball. Just using Kimball as an example, he actually has a fairly boring history. He's been a lobbyist for a long time, but he did used to work for the Department of Health and Human Services, and he worked for a member of Congress ages and ages ago. So this is very typical for members to kind of move through the public and private sector. And as they do that, they amass the kind of power that helps them hire deeper pocketed clients. So short remarks, and I hope that you guys get the chance to dig into some of our resources and address some of this stuff in the comments or in the questions. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. That was super interesting. James, you are up. You're muted.
Thank you. Can never do this right. Hello, everyone. I'm really excited to be here today. I'm going to share my screen with a few slides, and hopefully this will go without a hitch. So we are 40 days out to election day, and I want to talk to you a little bit about this afternoon about what I consider to be one of the most significant challenges confronting our multiracial democracy. It's a problem that often goes unnoticed and undiscussed, but it's about how racism shapes the day-to-day activities of the U.S. Congress, our nation's most foremost lawmaking institution, and the profound impact racism has on the formation of legislation that shapes our society. So it's a story about how exclusionary hiring practices create a white-dominated workplace on Capitol Hill, and that limits who can participate in both Washington and American politics, both in Washington and across the nation. This starts with the idea that Congress is the last plantation. This is not a name that I've given to Congress itself, but one that has roots going back at least 6 decades. Excuse me. So in 1964, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, one in which outlaw racial and gender discrimination in employment. And some have argued that this is the most important law that Congress has ever passed. It dramatically remade American workplaces, elevating the careers of people of color and white women in particular. But it is a law that didn't apply to Congress itself. So Congress earned the nickname as the last plantation because it was able to discriminate with impunity. And that is quite ironic from, that coming from Congress, which is supposed to be a expression of our democratic ideals, but also the chief rulemaking institution in the country. But it's an institution that doesn't have to play by the rules. I use this metaphor as a way of understanding how race shapes the congressional workplace. So I want to talk a little bit about who congressional staff are. They are the invisible force in American policymaking. These are the staffers who are working behind the scenes to write legislation, negotiate deals, organize hearings, and manage the legislative branch. They are the machinery, the mechanisms through which Congress works. They are the people who lawmakers trust and empower, and whose expertise and advice they consider and often follow in their political and policy decision making. They are also overwhelmingly white. For example, although people of color make up over 40% of the national population, they count for only 10% of top staffers in the House, like chiefs of staff, legislative directors, and communications directors, and approximately 11% of top staff in the Senate. And in fact, what we're sort of seeing with these numbers is that whether you're looking at top staffers or interns, they are a group of elites who are actually whiter than members of Congress themselves. I use this in the book, a way of thinking about this inequality as what I call legislative inequality, trying to explain both the explicit and implicit mechanisms that shape, who works on the Hill, and both race, gender, and class are influencing the composition, roles, and responsibilities. So what I sort of show in the book is to think about how the system is operating and how it impacts both legislative work, lawmaking, and the political profession. So I'll walk you quickly through what I argue is legislative inequality and the political production of racism. So I first look at how people get jobs on Capitol Hill. It is a very insular workplace, which is not necessarily surprising if we're thinking about it. Other elite workplaces is shaped upon who you know, and is often based upon previous work experiences. Oftentimes that means working on Capitol Hill, and which for decades meant working for free or working for a relatively low wage. All this sets the stage for a racially stratified workplace, one in which whites are again overrepresented in the congressional workplace, and particularly in those top positions. So this stratification, affects how works get done on the Hill. Again, staffers are the people who are participating in almost all legislative business, whether it is, you know, developing legislation, whether it is negotiating, whether it is organizing a hearing, whether it is, exercising some type of oversight over the executive branch or corporations. Um, and the experiences of staffers matter as well as their expertise. However, it matters that this group is predominantly white. And so, this influences, or I say has two key effects. One is on, of course, the policies that emanate from the congressional workplace, the law, but it also affects the other output of Congress, which is its personnel. Congress is by far one of the most largest political workplaces in the country. It has over 15,000 professional staff. So Congress is producing two things. Well, it's supposed to be producing legislation, but oftentimes that is not the case. But the thing that it is focusing and producing at a huge volume every year, it's staffers, it's political professionals, because it's these folks, once they leave the Hill, who are going to go off to more influential positions within the American political system. They are going to go back home to work or run for office in their local cities or in their states. They will go to become lobbyists. We'll talk a lot about it today. They might go work in the executive branch or even the Supreme Court. I think about, Supreme Court is this most senior member is Clarence Thomas, who got his start as a staffer in the Senate. Kamala Harris, got her political career started as a congressional intern in the Senate. So the inequality that resonates on Capitol Hill has this sort of reverberating effect, both in policy and in the personnel that sort of shape our politics. At the same time, we can understand Congress as an extremely white space. My work is built on the careers and experiences and the activism of Black staffers. I use them as a tool to help us understand how inequality is produced, but also how it can be challenged. So, oftentimes when we are thinking about elites, this leads us to focus on whiteness. However, I think what my work provides an opportunity to do is to think about Blackness here as well. I'll talk a little about this in questioning, but a lot of my work has been drawn on the fact that I was a congressional intern, and my experiences that I saw as an intern, particularly viewing Black staffers, wasn't necessarily something that I saw reflected in the literature. In part, I saw Black staffers as not only a group that was underrepresented, but that had a lot of power. So in my book, I talk about how diversity matters and all the ways in which Black staffers challenge, whiteness on Capitol Hill. The way that they sort of advocate or point out how legislation is racist. And you might be surprised that's not always obvious, and how legislation is, privileging whites. I show how they, sometimes discreetly advocate for marginalized interests to get their lawmakers' attention. And again, in ways in which they're typically focused on other elites, but they do what I call inclusive policymaking, which is to make Congress actually work, to make it be more democratic, to make it care about all of their constituents, and also how they work behind the scenes to change the congressional workplace to advocate for inclusive hiring practices. Zooming out, I think my work on a particular approach of studying elites has a few takeaways. One is to sort of link the sort of discussion on elites with theories of racism. I draw a lot of inspiration from Charles Mill's, canonical book, the racial contract, which he sort of argues that white supremacy is a political system. I see my work as trying to understand how does this political system operate, right? So as much as Congress is this lawmaking institution, it's also a very complex organizational workplace. And my work is trying to understand how that works, but also how that functions as an inequality regime, one in which race, gender, and class are central to explaining how this place works. It calls attention to how social or political elites are recruited, socialized, and credentialed through employment. Um, and at the same time, it focuses, allows us to focus on those who are underrepresented in these institutions. So for me, I'm studying Black workers, and it helps us to sort of, again, spotlight how inequality is produced, but it also, I'll say, helps us to challenge how we are thinking about police. My book is on Black staffers, and who are in many ways very, prototypical elites. Some have, come from very notable families. They have graduated from the top schools, but and they have access within this, hugely influential workplace. At the same time, I would consider us to also think about other workers in this space, whether they're in the cafeteria or whether they're police officers, and how they are also working within these elite institutions today. I'll say I'm really excited for this conversation and what will happen next, but I would like to give a plug to some work that many of us on this panel, including Daniel Laurelson and Wendy Lee, are excited about, which is that we are hosting a mini conference for race, class, and culture and US politics, which in many ways echoes a lot of the things that we'll be talking about today. We're calling this approach peopling politics, because again, it is highlighting often the people behind the scenes. It is going beyond lawmakers, whether it is thinking about political staffers, lobbyists, or people on the ground and how they understand our political system. So again, we're having this mini conference at the upcoming ESS conference in this March, and you can apply by October 15th, and I'm quite sure we will send this out over the listserv over the next day or two. Thank you.
Thanks so much, James. That was great. Wendy, you are up.
Great. Hi, thanks everyone. I'm super excited for this panel, and I'm such a huge fan of James, your work, and Sarah, the work that Open Secrets does. So I'm a postdoc at the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins, and today I'll be presenting a little bit of my work that is based on my dissertation, which is focused on this phenomenon of the revolving door. So revolving doors are this phrase that they get thrown around in DC pretty often, and it generally refers to the circulation of people between government and lobbying. Specifically, I focus on the role of corporate lobbyists. We know that it's a very common career path, and it moves in multiple directions. So people leave government to become lobbyists, people come from lobbying to go into government, and they often do this multiple times over the course of their careers. There's some data that shows that over half of all registered lobbyists have some kind of government experience. There's also research out there that is looking at sort of the relative prevalence of the revolving door in various federal agencies as well. And my research focuses on 3 questions. So how common is a revolving door, and sort of what patterns does it take on in people's careers? How does it actually shape individuals and their careers and their organizations and their resources? And then third, what are the structural effects of the revolving door? What does this actually mean for the policymaking process and democracy? And so my dissertation largely focused on one federal agency, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. This is a very small federal agency. It's technically under the White House, and it's led by a cabinet member, the U.S. Trade Representative. It usually employs about 200 people at once. I was actually a staffer there before I started grad school. So, like James, a lot of my interest is spurred on by personal experience. But what is really interesting about this agency is that it has a huge responsibility despite its relative size. It negotiates all international trade agreements on behalf of the president and Congress. And so these 200 people are negotiating, aspects all over of our economy around the world, right? This ranges from pharmaceutical the pharmaceutical industry to financial services to agriculture, manufacturing, environmental protections, data and privacy, you name it, it's probably in a trade agreement somewhere. So just as a case, this gives us a really interesting cross section of all of these different industries and regulatory issues. And they also have a coordinating function with other federal agencies as well in the executive branch. So one chapter of my dissertation looks at sequence analysis of revolving door careers. And the reason why I use sequence analysis is a little bit particular. Although I do love the data that Open Secrets provides, it relies on the Lobbying Disclosure Act, which has these specific sort of definitions of what lobbying is and who needs to register as a lobbyist. And there's sort of these loopholes. There's a lot of underreporting or lack of reporting that happens with the Lobbying Disclosure Act. So it's not a reliable source necessarily for getting the true population of revolving door lobbyists. So what I did was I collected the names and of all the policy relevant USTR employees from the first Bush administration through the end of the Trump administration. It's about 658 people. Research assistants helped me hand code their career and education backgrounds. And then we formatted this for social sequence analysis. And what that allows us to do is sort of measure the prevalence of certain subsequences of career transitions. And so the headline here is that in the past 20 years or so, over half of all trade negotiators have gone through some kind of revolving door. And these sort of breakdowns underneath are mutually exclusive. So a lot of them, most of them go through the exit side of the revolving door. They start in government, they go become lobbyists. A few, relatively less, but still a good amount, start in lobbying and then go into government. And then a lot of them actually go through multiple transitions. So they leave government to become a lobbyist and they go back into government. Or, they leave lobbying to go into government and they go back into lobbying. And so what this is telling us is that going through the revolving door is just not a single event. It's a sort of ongoing trajectory that happens over the course of someone's career. A lot of this data is actually also left censored, which means that we can't observe who hasn't gone through the revolving door yet, even though they might later on. And so just to kind of get a better sense of how that might look later on in someone's career, I subsetted my data for those who had careers longer than 35 years. And that number, that 51.7% number, goes up to almost 63%. So this is a very widespread phenomenon. There are issues maybe around generalizability. I think USTR is a particularly strong case that might not be as applicable to other federal agencies. But in this population, the revolving door is a major phenomenon. So this is what happens then when we have all of these revolving door careers. This is what I call the employment network or the revolving door network around USTR. These are all the organizations that are sending and receiving people from USTR. And I think as sociologists, we look at a network and it can mean a lot of different things. It can represent patterns of communication. It can represent patterns of resource exchange. There's a very sort of robust literature on policy networks and resource exchanges. It can mean sort of cultural similarity or differences. You might start to see cliques or clusters of organizations. And so all of that, I think, is really rich data that can be mined from this kind of network. Just to kind of filter the network a little bit into some interesting findings I've had so far. So what I call influence capacity, I measure this through eigenvector centrality, is concentrated in law firms and business interests. So this is what the network looks like in 2020 for the most sort of influential or highest eigenvector centrality nodes. You'll see that in yellow are law firms, red are private sector corporate interests. There's a few other sort of pink and purple organizations as well. Crowell and Mooring has the highest eigenvector centrality. They've hired 11 USTR employees over the course of my data. The second most influential organization is Amazon. They've hired 8. And interestingly, the US Chamber of Commerce, which is the biggest lobbying group in the US, they have the highest lobbying expenditures out of any other group. They have a lower eigenvector centrality, but a higher in degree, which means that they've hired more people from USTR than Amazon. And the reason for that is because Amazon tends to hire people who have also worked in other kinds of organizations that are that receive a lot of ties. It's a weighted measure of centrality. So people who work for Amazon have worked in the Senate, maybe have worked in the White House, other kinds of like central nodes, whereas the US Chamber of Commerce, those people might not have as distinguished resumes, for example. Another interesting finding is that in trade policy, a lot of the lobbying happens actually at a collective level. So you do get cases where Amazon alone might be reaching out to USTR, but more often what happens is that Amazon, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft get together and they lobby as a coalition. This is because trade policy is often sort of focused at the sectoral level and these broad sort of regulatory principles. And so these companies tend to sort of band together. And what happens when you start to look at these nodes as collective actors, you start to see that they become even more central to the network. So I added back in the state or government organizations here, and you see that the tech and internet industry is the single most central node in the USTR revolving door network. More central than the White House and the Department of Commerce or the State Department or the US Senate or House here in green. You also see that general business associations, so groups like the US Chamber of Commerce or the Business Roundtable, are present, but they're not quite as influential or central as financial services industry, for example, or the pharmaceutical industry. And so what this is telling me, at least, is that certain companies, certain industries have more capacity to influence government on their own or as a coalition rather than as a broad sort of business association. And so they can kind of go it alone. They don't need to go through a group like the US Chamber of Commerce to get to policymakers. And that I think has important implications for the relative fracturing or cohesion of corporations in politics. So I just want to sort of end on maybe a broader note, which is also one of the reasons why I got into this work. And this is a concern about regulatory capture, right? So instances where regulators and federal agencies are maybe doing the bidding of companies that they're supposed to be regulating. And oftentimes when we talk about regulatory capture, we're talking about sort of this idea of public interest versus industry interest. But in an article I put out in Socioeconomic Review last year, I actually argue that regulatory capture can happen when industry interests succeed in framing their private interests as the public interests. And this happens when, they are able to surround policymakers in their networks and sort of conflate, the public interests with their interests. And they do this by sort of appealing to the basic understandings and cultural schemas of policymakers. And so I think, these networks that we're seeing in the revolving door can often create the sort of facilitative conditions that give rise to regulatory capture. So in conclusion, if there's anything I want you to take away from this, it's that we really need to pay more attention to the revolving door. That means treating policy professionals and political elites as a workforce, like James was saying, treating political organizations as employers. And the revolving door shapes these careers, it shapes inequality within the profession, but also inequality within political organizations as well. In US trade policy, the revolving door overwhelmingly benefits law firms and business organizations. Public interest groups virtually are absent, non-existent in this network. And I think that really tells you a lot about who might be getting a seat at the table or who is more easily getting their foot in the door. Revolving doors can create conditions for capture, especially if they're heavily biased towards a limited set of interests. And this, to bring it back to the election this year, I think elections are really opportunities for people to revolve in and out, depending on who gets elected, depending on, what issues become more salient and, sort of drive lobbying. And this is an opportunity to change the structure of the network itself beyond just who's at the top of the ticket, but who are they hiring and who's in their ear. So thank you so much for the opportunity to share my research. I'm really excited for the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Wendy. So I have a couple questions for our panelists, and then we'll open it up for audience discussion. And I'd also like to invite the panelists, as I'm asking questions, if you want to pitch a question to one of your co-panelists, you're also welcome to do that. So the first thing I wanted to ask each of you to talk just a little bit about is your various experiences doing research on political elites. And I know you've each collected your data in different ways, but if you could talk a little bit about strategies you've used and or challenges you've faced, I think that would be really interesting. And I'd also love to hear sort of where you see this kind of research going. So how have you done the research you've done, and where do you see this research going? And maybe we could go in the same order we went in before, unless you don't want to.
That's fine. Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the aspects of open secrets is that we collect publicly available data. So we're heavily biased by what is publicly available. And that means that there are influential people in the world who are not donors. They might run nonprofits. They might work for some of these super PACs, as just a staffer, and that's not their main source of income, right? And so that's one problem, is like, it's easy to conflate money with power. It's easy to conflate money with a lot of things, but we don't necessarily know who is meaningfully, pulling the strings of power in Washington. Because that aspect of what happens, I think, isn't completely clear in publicly available data. And we know that some people are more important than others, just based on skill, based on tenure, based on relationships, and that's harder for us to track. As far as where I see this research going, I think that the outputs measure is critical. Like, we can't talk about what power looks like unless you can talk about what folks get out of it, and that it's very, very, very hard to do.
Thanks, Sarah. James, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that's jumping out at me is that, doing this work is really, really challenging. So, I've talked about studying congressional staffers, and, the first thing I encountered, doing this work was a lot of do's. And one of my professors, Herbert Gans, said, the best way to get data is like be in their face, and it's much harder to for them to say no. I think that's true, but they also said no in my face, right? They would often say lines like, "We don't participate in any type of social science research." So, there hasn't been a book on the congressional workplace in about 30 or 40 years, in part because Congress has become much more opaque and non-transparent and like non-compliant and sort of talking to us. So they're just not they're not responding to surveys. So it was particularly challenging. I see my work in like sort of two threads. So one is trying to figure out who exactly works on Capitol Hill. And so I've done a number of things through surveys, both in person and online, to try to figure out this data. And, there has been lots of resistance from, nasty emails to, staffers literally organizing not to talk to me and my research team. Um, and, I think the way that I have, tried to get access to these various types of data is to be creative and collaborative. Um, and so, one, going back to my short presentation, thinking about Black staffers as particularly powerful people. I could not have done my book without the help of Black staff networks, who in many ways were willing to vouch for me, but also I think they were also strategically using me to unmask a problem that they knew was a problem. Um, and so I think that they were, just like very helpful, helping to me to get data. I think the other thing that I'd say, I do a lot of collaborative work with democracy reform groups. So I write policy papers. And I think, studying elites requires some type of creative methods, because I think oftentimes, or what really interesting to me, like in my really initial status doing this work, was that I got my PhD at Columbia, and the legitimacy of Columbia did not matter at all. No one cares. However, they did care if you were working with a nonprofit or a think tank in DC. That had much more legitimacy, right? So the fact that I partner with, let's say, payout interns or the Joint Center for Political Economic Studies gave me actually much more access to these folks. And also the fact that some of my work has been a policy paper that might be featured in Politico or the Washington Post. The fact that this would become widely read by the general public versus, no shade to academic articles and journals, but it's a different audience. And what was surprising to me is that, staffers not only responded to that, but they were eager to talk to me, in part because they were trying to shape the narrative, right? So, I, went to being invisible to being, this sort of slightly sawed off person, or someone that had to be managed to manage a problem because I was about to expose something. So again, where I hope this work goes is trying to sort of utilize, I would say, creative methods to understand this problem. I think there is a lot of work or necessity of sort of talking to folks, understanding and explaining how these places works in a way that I think resonates and generates a lot of public interest. And I think just being more collaborative.
Great. Thanks, James. Wendy?
Yeah, I guess what I'll add to that is even though what I presented today was very, I think, more on the quantitative side of things, I actually could not have done any of this work or thought about, the revolving door the way I did without first doing ethnographic qualitative work. And it was only through that field work and, being in DC that I realized, okay, like some forms of lobbying data are better than others. I can make these kinds of claims from this data, but not those kinds of claims. And so, yeah, like knowing even just where to look, I think requires kind of thinking more with like a qualitative eye when it comes to political elites, because, like the data sets that we get are kind of shaped by those in power as well. So we kind of have to be aware of that, how our data are generated. And yeah, I mean, I know I like a lot, like I benefited from having an insider status. I was a political appointee's assistant, so a lot of people just knew me or remembered me or something at some point when I first started my research. And that really did help to get people to talk to me and get interviews. But I think what really struck me too is that it there are certain things that like cultural capital, social capital that you need to like maybe get your foot in the door, but like people are very open and willing to talk. I think there's there's a lot of research, qualitative research that we can do as sociologists that is totally possible, but maybe we just assume that, I don't know, the state is a black box or something and that we can't do it. So yeah, I would just say like if you can get to DC or the state capitol or wherever it is that you're studying political elites and just try talking to people, like that is like a really important thing. It will really add a lot of insight to your work, rather than just relying on maybe like pre-made data sets.
Great. Thank you. I just want to open it. Do any of the three of you have questions or comments from each other from what we've heard so far? If not, I'll just keep ask you another question or two, then open to the audience. Okay, you can keep thinking about it. But to keep things going, Sarah, in your talk, you mentioned a number of times the sort of question of outputs, and I know you don't study that directly, and none of you are looking at directly at how does political giving or how much are rich people able to influence political outcomes, but I think each of your work touches on that in some ways. So I'd love to just hear what your thoughts are about how political giving or how sort of, well-off people generally are able to influence election outcomes, are able to influence what happens once people are elected. Sort of the central question of money in politics.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I have a long and a short answer to that. And the short answer is that uh, unless your candidate wins, you are not influencing the outcome, right? But that's just such a finite way of looking at things, because you're never going to, thankfully, in the United States, you're never going to have a case where somebody can just buy an outcome. And I say that with full confidence, because if that were the case, we would have President Mike Bloomberg right now. And people forget that he spent $1 billion in 1 month in March of 2020 and won 1 delegate in American Samoa. So, money is significant, but it's certainly not the only element that indicates, who is in office. That being said, I'll revert back. I'll return to Timothy Mellon, who gave $50 million to a Trump allied super PAC the day after Trump's conviction. Now, as it turns out, Trump's conviction was great for his fundraising. I don't know if that was expected on that day, but it was. He had his best fundraising day of the cycle the day after he was convicted of all of the felonies. And prior to that, he had had a pretty quiet couple of months in terms of fundraising. But Mellon's influx of cash to his allies can help keep candidates in the race that might otherwise falter. Trump was going to be in the race forever, but having access to that money means that via his super PAC and sort of his allies having access to it means that he can continue producing advertisements even when times are tough for him. Additionally, Mellon single-handedly essentially kept RFK in the race for so long, and that was significant in terms of the actual narrative discussed this cycle. So, those are both because we're talking about vaccines. Who's talking about vaccines anymore? We are now because of RFK. And that has to do with Tim Mellon. So that is power. That is extremely hard to measure, but it is absolutely power. And I think that we would be ignorant to kind of ignore the message setting, narrative setting, framing, and priming, actually, all of the media effects that these elites can manipulate via donations.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, one thing I study is how campaign professionals do the work that they do, and they can't put out their messages if nobody's funding the PACs or the campaigns that they're working for, and that those messages in turn shape, so much of how people understand what politics is, to the tone of politics, all of it. So, and I think you're finding that more and more of the money is going to the really extreme PACs is also really important for understanding so much about our contemporary political environment. Yeah, so I just wanted to add that in there. Wendy or James, do you want to talk at all?
But just chime in. I mean, I think everything I think we're discussing, and we study very different sectors of the American political system, it's all connected. And in many ways, I'm just wishing, there is an updated volume or addition to, the political elite, right? In many ways, what, C. Wright Mills is talking about in the sort of post-world era, doesn't sort of fit today, right? And I think it's much more expansive, but I think what we're sort of seeing is a lot of different systems, organizations, and institutions, workplaces work together to perpetuate inequality in ways that are both visible and not visible. So I just want to sort of put that out there. I think this is all sort of connected. I think the other thing I would sort of highlight is, Daniel and Wendy and I have all sort of talked about this to a certain extent, is, that, we are sometimes the lone sociologists in the room who are studying these things, or who are in political institutions, and it often, I think, highlights, well, what is a sociological approach here? What is the value of sociology? And I want to say, I guess, two things. One is there is so much to be said about how inequality is being perpetuated in the institution. I'm just really inspired by what Sarah is saying. I think in everything we are saying about these data sets, I think the thing that it keeps in the back of my mind is like we still don't know so much, right? And so we're thinking about the work that scholars who are coming up in the field. I think the field is ripe for sociological explanation. At the same time, I would say the thing I see connecting all of us, which I think is a hallmark of sociological research, and American politics, is this idea that politics is relational, and these sort of social relationships are foundational, right? So when you are giving money, like Sarah said, you're not necessarily buying an outcome, but you are nurturing a relationship, and sometimes that relationship might pan out, and your candidate wins, and you can sort of influence policy that way. But it's the same thing I see in my work studying congressional staffers. People are always networking, right? That's how you get stuff done. And sometimes that person that you met might be helpful, and sometimes it might not be, right? There's sort of this, you don't know when the returns of this relationship are going to resonate. But it is this sort of shared foundation that politics is relational. And so I think a lot of the work that we are doing is studying how social relationships show up and matter in American politics.
Great, thank you. Wendy, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I agree with all of that. I think, what Sarah was saying about money not being determinative it's so obvious if you look at it, but I think sometimes rhetorically, even sociologists are like, oh, that thing happened because, rich corporations or whatever. I'm like, wait, no, draw that line for me, because that's not, it's not automatic. If it was, then the US Chamber of Commerce would have won everything they ever wanted. They do win a lot, but, not all the time. And so like I think the case that I focused on for my first paper was these tech lobbyists who were like super focused on getting this specific area of trade agreements passed, and they were very successful in it, and they sort of institutionalized it into future trade agreements. But what happened after I finished my research and Biden got elected was that he appointed a new US trade representative who was like, we're going to stop that. And I think there's a conjuncture of things that have to happen in order for people to have influence, right? You kind of have to have a sort of requisite level of resources to be in DC or be in the ear of whoever it is, whether that's hiring lobbyists or donating money. But then you also have to have like the certain levels of political will, or just like the political, I think, context also shifts sometimes. And so it is still the case that like tech interests are the most central, most embedded organizations in the revolving door network, but they're kind of hitting a brick wall now with the Biden administration because of who he appointed. And so I think we I it it's useful to think about money and sort of the ways that it opens up opportunities, but yeah, it's not that straight line of money equals power, right?
Great. Thank you so much. Those are great answers. I have some more questions, but I want to open it up to audience questions, and you can either use the little raise hand icon, or I'll switch to gallery. You can also literally wave at me, or you can put a question in the chat, and I'll just call on people as I see them. So I'll give people a minute to think about if they have questions, and then I can also keep asking questions if need be. Okay, I won't do the thing that I do in my classes where I just sit there quietly until somebody asks a question. I've got another one for you guys. And then, people in the audience, if you do want to ask a question, let me know one way or another. So I was hoping you guys could talk a little bit more about when you're for junior scholars or senior scholars who wanted to get into this kind of research. Do you have advice for people who are interested in studying elite politics or studying political elites?
I'm probably going to pass that question off to the others. Other than that, one of my lessons for everyone is like, be persistent, and attend that networking event that you don't want to because it's at 6 o'clock and you'd rather be doing something else, anything else. But that's how power is made, and relationships can matter greatly, as we are discussing. So I don't know any of the people I study, so I'm not a great example for this.
I mean, again, I think there are multiple ways of going at this problem, right? So, I have some quantitative research that I've done that involves in talking to no one. And it's actually just quite easier because I'm talking to no one and I don't have those barriers that I have with people. But I mean, I think it is, a lot what Sarah was saying. It's just a lot of persistence because there are a lot of closed doors, even though they're revolving for some folks. Uh, I mean, I think, to sort of go back to my earlier comments, as like sociologists coming up in the field, I would try to stay true to what sociologists do well, which is to really focus on how and explaining how things work. And I think, again, there is lots of rooms to understand how this really large system works and to sort of make connections that are not or that haven't been made before. And so, I mean, I think it's just like digging into a particular area. I think that's particularly meaningful to you, and trying to understand how this system really works. Sitting down to talk to folks, and again, I think a lot. I think what's exciting is that we are beginning to understand. The nuances of American politics, and particularly as like workplaces in really fascinating ways, that's happening recently. But there has been, I would say, a blind eye turned to this. So I'm just really excited that we're doing this work now.
Yeah, I guess I would say it depends on, I think, the specific research questions or policy areas that people are interested in. But like one thing I would like one big piece of advice that I had to learn is that like you do want to sort of figure out what the social norm, and this is I think just broad ethnographic like fieldwork advice, like figure out what the broad social norms of your field are and make sure you like make yourself legible within those norms. Like one thing that came up in a couple interviews I did, especially early on, was like, I would ask, a policymaker, like, so how do you interact with lobbyists? And then immediately, like in reaction to the word lobbyists, they would be like freeze up and be like, I'm not like, I don't interact with lobbyists. Like, like we don't do that kind of stuff in this agency. And then I would be like, okay, so I know they interact with lobbyists because like another thing I did, and this is something that I think is useful for people before they go into the field, is Freedom of Information Act requests are really good at kind of giving you like you can see people's emails, schedules, you can kind of get a sense of like maybe the day-to-day world they live in and how they do their work. So I would really look into that, even if you're not filing your own FOIA requests. There are probably journalists who have filed FOIA requests in the agencies that you're interested in, and you can probably email them to get access to them. And so one thing I realized was like, okay, I can't call these people lobbyists because then no one will talk to me. So I started calling them stakeholders. And I started asking, how do you do public engagement? And then they were all like, oh, well, Microsoft came in and then Pfizer came in. Like, so like there's those kinds of things I think you need to like figure out that are particular to like the people you're studying. Yeah, I think that's like a huge thing too, to just get access to the people you want to study.
Great. Thank you both, or thank you all. That was really helpful, and also just sort of sheds lights on some of the work that you've already been talking about. So I see a hand, but I got a question on text first, so I'll ask that. And then Christina, I see your hand, and you'll be next. So I have a question from Lisa Brush on specifically for Wendy or Sarah, or both. Do you have a sense of the reality of what Ben Tarnoff calls venture-backed Trumpism? Does the centrality of venture capital to tech money make a difference in how we understand elite politics?
Yeah. So I think what this is referencing is the apparent switch from Silicon Valley venture tech executives from giving to Democrats in the past to giving to Republicans, to specifically Trump now. I'll say two things on that. The Silicon Valley generally includes a lot of elite. So there are people in those tech companies outside of venture capital more, but in venture capital too, they are still giving to Democrats. So there is a big disconnect between what Elon Musk, who we don't even include in tech actually in Open Secrets, but who Elon Musk is giving to versus who his employees are giving to. Does that matter in this sense of the conversation? I don't think so, because if Trump wins, he is going to have this connection to these elite venture capitalists, and that will inherently change the policies that are considered when he is starting to, when AI is regulated someday, hypothetically. So I do think that that's significant. I think it's a little bit overstated looking at the data, though, because we have an industry that has typically given essentially all of its money to Democrats, and now you have a small number of elite, white men, Wall Street types, really, who are crossing party lines. I think is a little bit too early to say that, the tides have completely switched. But that's also typical of a maturation of an industry, right? Like in the beginning, even even some of the mainstream Fortune 500 industries that we think of now were outside of the status quo systems of power. Everyone gets absorbed into the process eventually and moderates. So I would keep that in mind too.
Yeah, I'm not actually familiar with the phrase, and it hasn't really come up in my field work. I think the reason for that is like the tech lobbyists I know and I interact with are like some of the most boring people you could think of. Like the idea of like, I don't know, like the sort of like smoky back room, like glorious, like glamorous lobbyist is not there. I'm sure those people exist, but they're not the ones I deal with. These are like the regulatory lobbyists that I'm talking to are like, you know, very sort of like unglamorous people, and they get their jobs because they're able to sort of develop this like technical credibility and expertise that is legitimate to policymakers. And so yeah, like I mean, I'm sure there are times when they, and this is a really interesting thing, like these lobbyists are sort of these like go-betweens between policymakers, but then also they have, their corporate executives that might be like, you know, telling them kooky weird things, or like pushing their whatever the bottom line of the company is, and then their job is to sort of maybe filter some of that or translate it or make it more palatable to policymakers. So I don't really see a lot of that happening in sort of the day-to-day lobbying work that a lot of these regulatory lobbyists are doing.
Thanks, Wendy. Christina, I see you have your hand up. Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for today. It was really helpful to hear. I'm a graduate student right now and sort of getting into my dissertation proposal, and I'm interested more at the local level of politics and political elites there, and kind of something that as I'm kind of going through my project and articulating it and how to frame the actors and is in part just so much of the connections of the local to these broader political sort of organizations, or whether it's like to Congress members and caucuses, to and just to national politics in general, and let alone also living in a time where I like to think of just the local and national, let alone global, just getting really compressed in a really strange, immediate way. And so I know that the work, at least the work described here, is at this congressional federal level. But if you'd have any like thoughts or insights about how to, I don't know, framing a local focused project without losing these like bigger, I guess, implications.
Any panelist who wants to tackle that, please go.
I guess. I think, Open Secrets does tiptoe into the world of local data availability, and that is far and away one of the most challenging areas to explore. So, as a scholar, and I completely agree with what James said earlier about and Wendy actually, about a lot of this research needing to be qualitative, ethnographic, on the ground, meeting people, having conversations that will help build your theory of your theory. I was going to say theory of change. That's a very nonprofit jargonism. That's the other half of my day. But it'll help build your theory, right? It'll help feed those questions. So my advice, from whatever it matters, which is probably not much, is, be connected with the community that you live in. Ideally, you live in a community with good data availability as well. I live in Chicago. We have great data availability. It would be a wonderful place to study the intricacies of relationships from this federal, state, and local level. If you live in a state like South Dakota, for example, that's going to be a bigger problem. So, there's a story there, and part of that does have to do with data availability. The other thing is that I would say is, again, just emphasizing how important it is to have the conversations to understand how the politics works in your area too. That's another key. I'm a political scientist by training, so I'm going to say everything's about politics, but Chicago politics does not equal politics in Miami, Florida. And that is, like, I cannot overstate how critical it is that you recognize that as a junior scholar, starting to do that kind of research. Understand the politics that you are looking at. And that matters greatly. Congressional is just one case. So any of the communities that you're working in are going to be a completely different case.
So when you said Chicago and Miami, I lived in Chicago, partly studied it from Miami. So
well, there you go.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, I guess I would also say, like some of the concepts that we've been talking about, like following the money and like looking at people's backgrounds and, career trajectories and relationships are equally applicable at the local level. Seeing maybe, for example, like in DC, like a certain schools keep coming up and people are like, oh, I got my job because I went to Georgetown Law or whatever, right? And like that also happens on the local level of these sort of, like pipelines and relationships too. So that could be one way to think about it as well. And then I don't know if this is what your question was referring to, but like local politicians and state level politicians also get involved in like federal lobbying too. Like there's interest groups that represent counties. There's interest groups that represent like mayors, for example, and because they're always looking for federal funding and stuff. And so yeah, like those dynamics I think also trickle down to the local level.
I think, I don't know, like I've been hearing these questions about like building your own like theory and like trying to see where it fits. And if I were to look at the long arc of, putting out a book and then starting this research, which was like 15 years ago, my theory kind of actually never changed. And in many ways, I think oftentimes, I think this work is like challenging for, I would say sociologists who are studying politics, because I feel like, if I were studying urban sociology or housing gentrification, I would know the exact literature to like put myself in. And so, the challenge for me, which is also very exciting, is to like build this like theory of knowledge myself. And it's different because you're working, or I'm working across different subfields and disciplines. But I think, my advice to you is kind of to listen to your own perspectives and to build a theory of how you think this, whatever problem, institution, is actually working, right? And to really spend time just sort of developing that and thinking through the nuances, and then sort of thinking about how this fits with other theories. So, for me, I knew that everybody was there telling me that networking was matter. I had built out my model of the last plantation very early on as a graduate student. And then I sort of found how this related to work that sociologists were doing in elite workplaces, or race in the workplaces. And then I sort of used this as a way of both comparing and contrasting about how my case fit and how it was different, as a way of trying to sort of see what was particular about my case. So I think I would just spend particularly your like some time just trying to figure out what you think is true about what you're seeing and building out your own theory, and then sort of trying to see where that fits for us in sociology.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Great. Thanks, Saul. I don't see other questions from the audience, so I'll ask another one of my questions.
Question in the chat.
Oh, there's a question in the chat. You're right. Okay. I will read it. So thank you, Jennifer. So Clarence Lowe says regarding political elites in the local, this is more of a comment for the author. I think there's a book, Bonds of Inequality, about race and urban development politics in San Francisco. So that's more of a comment suggestion for Christina. Other questions from folks who are here or comments are also welcome.
I have a question for Sarah, actually.
Great.
So, I mean, I mentioned the Lobbying Disclosure Act data is like notoriously unreliable. Are there other ways that Open Secrets or maybe some of the other organizations you might work with are like trying to more systematically collect data on advocacy and lobbying activity beyond just registrations?
Yeah. There's a nonprofit called Legistorm. I'm sure you're familiar with. A lot of their data is gated. They also use lobbying disclosure information as their basis of their data work, but they spent, that's their modus operandi. That's what they do. Yeah. I will say a lot of what we get on people is actually from news reporting. There are, the rags in DC, like the Politico, can't remember what it's called, but like the Politico feature that talks about who's moving where is important. Duns and Bradstreet has a sort of an encyclopedia of who is, lobbying and moving from place to place, if you can get your hands on that. So those are, produced by specific entities that focus on personnel. Political influence. Yes, Wendy.
Yeah, it's like my nerdy it's like a gossip column basically, but it's just like these people got contracted to do this work. This person's moving to that firm. Yeah, it's great.
The Department of Justice Foreign Lobbying Disclosure Act disclosures actually describe in much more detail who's meeting with whom. If you can, like I said, like you mentioned, FOIA members to get their schedules. There's like 2 or 3 who produce them, but voluntarily, or used to. But that's all I got. I'm sure you have more techniques than we do. We look at a lot of, LDAs, which are not great.
So I think my last question to wrap us up that I'd love to have each of you answer is just what would you like to see more of in terms of research in this field, in terms of research on elites? What do you think is a hole that you hope somebody fills, or work that you'd like to see get more attention, or etc. And we can go in the same order for our last wrap up question.
So I mean, I'm excited to see James's book because I was just going to say like race and gender and intersectionality. Obviously there's no like race column that you fill out when you are making a donation. And maybe that's not obvious to some people, but it is obvious to me. Like people don't tell you who they are. So the research on that is very limited. And oftentimes actually pretty bad. Like people will just look at the name and be like, that person is, Asian American. Terrible. So I would love to see more quality research. And I think that on that aspect. And then I also think that, as an external person to this community, I would read a book on social media and the way that it is being used by certain, especially younger members and staffers to exert power. I don't know if folks are familiar with the Instagram account, Dear White Staffers, which is anonymous, run by staffers in Congress, highlighting the way that members of Congress treat employees. Super interesting. And I think that there are communities like that and users and influencers, broadly defined, that are doing a lot to open up some of what was traditionally closed. So I would totally read that if anyone wants to write it for me.
Great, thanks.
I would say, just to sort of go back to what Sarah was saying and also Wendy's conversation, you know, when I often think about like inequality and like politics and thinking about how do we fix this, I think particularly in my lens of racism, I think we're imagining something, this sort of gargantuan like push to overhaul these systems, which I'm not sure if it's actually possible. But I think my number one solution has always been about like data transparency. I think we are limited by what we know and don't know. So, you know, Sarah brought up the fact that we don't have data on donors by their race. We don't have race data on congressional staff or people who work in Supreme Court and the White House. And so it means that I have to go to political influence to look up someone's photo to get the ID them for their race. Then I'm only limited because that takes a long time. So I can only do a few hundred staffers versus and look at the entire workforce. So I think, you know, these institutions could work a lot different. It could be more effective and more democratic if we had better data about how everything is working together. Thinking about work that I'm excited about, I would say we've talked a lot about like elites. And I kind of want to sort of, I guess, trouble that, right? So whether it's both elite institutions, I guess I would be really interested in reading a book that tells the story about how these places work, that focuses on the the people who have the least amount of power within them. So, you know, I'm just really interested in cafeteria workers in Capitol Hill. I think they're a fascinating group, and they have this long history of racial activism. They have been much more outspoken than staffers, right? They had literally put their their careers on the line, but we don't deem them as powerful. But they, in many ways, have really great access and could tell us a lot because they are serving these very influential people, and there's just so many incredible stories to be told. And last thing I would say is that like people out there in the field, I would say just be curious. I think one of the things that um, I see in news headlines, and there are a lot of damning things. That's like I was like, oh, I'm frustrated, but I'm also curious, like what's actually happening behind the scenes. And I don't think it is as clear or as cut or black and white as is being reported. So I'm thinking about you know whether it's Biden or Harris or Trump. I'm also thinking about what are the dialogues that are happening. What are the moments that are leading to what we see later? I think that is a area that we could really explore and push to explain how politics happens, right? And but also to explain how politics is a result of these sort of peopled interaction. I'm giving a shout out to our mini conference that we'll be having at ESS in March.
Great.
Yeah. I was just going to add to that. I mean, also shout out to our mini conference. Like one of the, I think, exciting things about the work that folks like us are doing, but then also I think also in political science, they're kind of thinking a little bit more about political economy now and yeah, thinking about politics not necessarily as sort of these a personal sort of institutions, but as actually populated by people who have agency and identities and backgrounds and so and sociologists were really good at thinking about that. So we have a lot to sort of give to these questions that maybe traditionally have been monopolized by political scientists. And yeah, like the life course, for example, like having kids and dealing with two like working spouses, like that's something that comes up in my work all the time to, as people explain why they change their jobs and go through the revolving door. Um, and yeah, I think another thing is also, I forget who exactly this came up in like just like my social media a couple weeks ago, but I think there's also a place for us to talk about the role of universities and foundations and nonprofits and in sort of influencing policy. Most of our ire is directed at economists, but we get a lot of like, sociologists get a lot of federal funding as well, and corporate funding that maybe gets like not literally but or legally but like sort of metaphorically laundered sometimes through university research centers. And so I think maybe even just expanding beyond what we think of like as traditional institutional interest group politics towards these other kind of dynamics of power is really exciting too.
Thank you. So thank you all of our panelists for a really excellent conversation. Thank you, audience, for coming. I think these conversations about how to think about both, both the substantive findings that you have, but also the issue of just how do we understand the people who play such important roles of politics, but are often sort of hidden from public view, unlike sort of the politicians and the very active Twitter owners and a few other people, are so important to understanding how politics works in this country. So thank you very much to our panelists. I give you live actual applause. People can also do these things. And everyone who's still here, please keep your eyes peeled for our last panel, which will be on public opinion, participation and turnout, and will be happening sometime towards the end of October. Thank you again to everybody for participating. Nice work, everybody. All right, I'll see you guys.
Well done.
Yeah, really great outline, Wendy. That made my job very, very easy.